otherwise.
Welcome to FCPA Flash, the official podcast of FCPA Professor and moderated by Professor Mike Koehler. FCPA Professor is the leading source of daily FCPA news and commentary and the most authoritative source for those seeking to understand and apply the FCPA. To learn how FCPA Professor can elevate your FCPA knowledge, please visit www.fcpaprofessor.com. FCPA Flash is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group manages your integrity and risk profile, turning compliance into a competitive advantage. The Red Flag Group assists companies in developing and maintaining efficient and effective corporate governance and compliance programs and has a proven track record in providing integrity due diligence investigations in 194 countries.
Welcome to FCPA Flash. This is Professor Mike Koehler, and in today's episode, I'm pleased to have as a guest Lee Dunst. Lee is a partner in the New York office of Gibson, Dunn Crutcher, where he is a member of the firm's white-collar defense and investigations practice group. Lee has extensive experience in white-collar, criminal, and regulatory investigations, including those involving the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Thanks for joining us today, Lee.
Thanks, Mike. Happy to speak to you and folks listening to the podcast.
Now, you recently wrote a piece on the DOJ's expectations for voluntary disclosure and cooperation in FCPA enforcement actions that caught my eye. And in the article, you use words like, and by the way, this is a compliment, the much ballyhooed release of the DOJ Pilot Program, DOJ officials on the speaking circuit, the finger-wagging of DOJ officials, and so on and so forth. Now, what motivated you to write this article that we'll be talking about, and furthermore, to perhaps use some of those words that some people in the FCPA community might view as provocative and might view as, rocking the boat?
Well, I guess my intention wasn't to rock the boat too much. I guess it was just to at least give some thoughts in a maybe in a less dry way in the article in the blog post that I wrote and was posted at NYU. I think what had led me to write about this was just thinking a lot about the practice right now in the FCPA space, sort of in the current environment, and how it's changing and has been changing in recent years, but especially in the last year or so. I mean, I've been working in this space for now almost 10 years, involving DOJ and SEC investigations as well as internal investigations and compliance monitorships. And in light of sort of the expanded enforcement environment here, there's just much more focus and discussion in this space, as Mike, as you certainly know, and those listening on the webcast. And I think one of the frustrations for many years was a lack of transparency, of course, in terms of charging decisions, and then also what you never heard about, which was decisions not to bring enforcement actions. So I do think there's value, significant value, in connection with what was announced in the pilot program, in particular earlier this year, and trying to provide some guidance and some direction. And certainly folks in the DOJ have engaged in a very aggressive effort to be out there speaking at various panels and conferences to get the message out in terms of their views on this, which then, of course, gets repeated again and again by publications that pick up on it, as well as the internet. And any time somebody at the DOJ says something positive or says something negative, their words are parsed like criminologists used to parse words back in the Soviet Union. I mean, every word that's used is analyzed and trying to understand exactly what it means. So maybe sometimes, in particular with Yates, for example, there might have been, I think, an overreaction in the community among some commentators and practitioners in terms of how that was sort of new, when in fact, in many ways, it's not really new. It's just a restatement of what was already out there, but re-emphasizing the DOJ's focus on it. But I think my intention in writing on this topic was just the fact that we're now almost 6 months, I guess, or so since the pilot program was announced, and we're on the eve, or maybe right now, it's just about right now, the 1-year anniversary of Yates. So it seemed like a good time to think about it and share some of the thoughts that I have, as well as some of the thoughts that some of my clients have been expressing confidentially, of course.
Yeah, and your client interaction here is an interesting piece of the post that we're talking about here, and more substantively, you stated, and I'll quote you here and ask you to sort of elaborate on this, is you say, when I discuss cooperation and voluntary disclosure issues with many of my sophisticated clients, cooperation and voluntary disclosure, of course, being key aspects of the Yates Memo, which, as you mentioned, is a year old. Key aspects, of course, of the FCPA Pilot Program, which was announced in April 2016. You're saying that some of your sophisticated clients chafe at the DOJ's expectations in this current supercharged enforcement environment. Some of my clients view the DOJ's approach to voluntary disclosure and cooperation as taking the decision-making process out of the hands of reasonable company management. And you further state that you've had senior in-house counsel that they are adults who have decades of experience making tough calls every day, and as a result, reasonably believe that they can make decisions on voluntary disclosure and cooperation on their own without being told what to do by the DOJ. Now, I think this is a very important observation to make, by a practitioner like yourself, who is obviously having these frequent conversations with the business folks who are obviously impacted by the new era of FCPA enforcement. And for whatever it's worth, it's consistent with my own observations that I think in this current environment there are a lot of eyes rolling and resentment in corporate offices, not about the FCPA per se, but about some of the FCPA enforcement agency positions and policies that are being articulated. So can you elaborate? Obviously you can't disclose confidences, but elaborate on some of the common threads or the themes or the concerns that prompted you to write that.
Sure. I mean, I think it's something that it is really something that I've taken away from working in this space for almost 10 years and working with a lot of clients, especially larger clients with global operations and really fully built out compliance programs internally and internal investigation mechanisms where they are regularly dealing with these issues that really run the gamut from a stray whistleblower email to something being undercovered by internal audit, or something maybe more significant that's been identified. And I think that for some of my clients, larger corporations that are more sophisticated, that have dealt with these issues before, many of them feel that step one in the process is not picking up the phone and calling the Department of Justice before you know anything, or when you know virtually nothing. Many of them view, from their perspective, a reasonable approach to take, and it's an approach that I, in most cases, agree with, especially in when it's smaller issues, is figure out if there is an issue, or figure out if there is a problem, and take reasonable steps to evaluate it, understand the facts, interview witnesses, maybe do more than that, and then reach your own conclusion. That conclusion may be that there's no problem. That conclusion may be that there may be some kind of potential problem, and then make a reasonable decision once you've done all that work, whether or not you think you've got a disclosure issue or not. And that's the way a lot of my, larger clients who've been through this issue before approach this. And that process that I've just described, to conduct an internal investigation, either one that the company does on its own, or one that they're partnering with outside counsel, or one that maybe outside counsel does, that doesn't happen overnight. That, depending upon the scope of the issue or the geography, if it's challenging, can take several months at a minimum. And you may not, from the moment that you've identified an issue to the time that you've reached some conclusions, could take upwards of a year. There's not an unreasonable time frame. And many clients do that. Well, I'm going to go through that reasonable process first before I'm just going to pick up the phone and call the regulator when I don't know anything about what this really is. And I think a lot of my clients view that as a reasonable approach to take. And I think they, interpret, especially the, Yates, and then by extension, the pilot program, as really sort of suggesting otherwise, that, well, if I've just gone through that reasonable process that I've just described, and I've actually figured out that, yeah, maybe I do have a problem, and then I call up the government, and it's been a year or 6 months, say, am I now no longer getting my full credit? And, I do have clients that sort of hear that at the outset and say, well, I'm going to call them now and tell them what? I don't really know what I'm telling them. And that's just, to tell them now, so I'm chasing the ring that I may be getting, full credit. So I think that's sort of the reaction that I've had some clients have, is they feel like, well, I'm the messaging that they hear from DOJ is, call early and often, but maybe early when I don't really know anything. And a lot of my more sophisticated clients who have dealt with these issues before, both minor issues as well as significant issues, and clients who sometimes handle things internally, and certainly other times have had me pick up the phone almost immediately and disclose things to regulators. So ones who take different approaches along the spectrum, but they take those approaches based upon sort of their sort of years of experience in handling this.
Yeah, the same enforcement attorneys that, of course, say disclose early and often while they're at the DOJ or the SEC are, history has indicated, going to take a materially different position when they go into private practice, as many of them do. I think one of the reasons why I liked what you said on this point was what I see sort of as a broader issue here, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, and that's the following. Yes, the FCPA is a specific law, and yes, FCPA issues, of course, are legal issues. But at the end of the day, the notion of what one ought to do as a corporate manager, a board of director, an audit committee member, when faced with potential legal issues in a company, more often than not, that is a business judgment call by a business manager and a quintessential sort of business judgment issue that the law provides broad discretion for corporate managers. Is some of the resentment perhaps here that the business judgments that they have, that they possess, that they exercise every day of the week in other areas is not being honored or is being dismissed by the government when it comes to this specific topic?
Well, I don't know what's in the government's head there, but I'd say that that's actually part of my concern right now generally in this space is that, if I'm a company that maybe does not have as sophisticated a compliance program, or maybe has never sort of faced these issues before, or maybe has a board of directors that's never faced these issues before, that all they really know is the publicity that's come around over the last year, which was obviously the intention of it, in terms of trying to get the message out with Yates and with the Yates Memo, with the pilot program, is disclose early, and I think that for either for lawyers outside counsel who maybe don't confront these issues as much, and certainly in-house management that doesn't, I think they hear that message, and when they're making sort of even their business judgment analysis, they hear that, and I say, and I think their reaction is, well, the risk is too high. If I'm evaluating this in terms of the facts and circumstances that I know early on, which may not be much, being outweighed by potentially being outweighed by broad statements that, well, if you don't self-disclose early, you're going to lose your cooperation credit hypothetically down the road. A lot of them sort of say, well, why am I going to go out on the limb? The easiest thing for me to do is just go in and tell them what I know now, and go from there. And I think that's the part to me that is, I think is somewhat at odds with the notion that I think that reasonable corporate managers can make these decisions on their own. And it's not a function of taking a problem, they identify a problem and stick it in a drawer and pretend it doesn't exist. I'm not saying that, of course, because if you identify a problem, you have to do something about it. But doing something about it doesn't necessarily always mean that I have to, send an email or pick up the phone and tell the folks in Washington what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. And in more cases than not, a perfectly acceptable and legal and ethical, I would submit, reaction to an FCPA issue is to investigate it, to remediate it, to perhaps discipline or terminate culpable actors, to enhance compliance policies and procedures, all internally without, voluntarily disclosing to the government. And you're right, I think sometimes that completely acceptable and legal response, more often than not, is sort of lost in all the headlines and the policy statements and so on and so forth. Now, the focus of your article is mostly about voluntary disclosure and cooperation, and how some of the DOJ's recent policies may, to quote you here, may have the unintended result of eviscerating the adult judgment of some companies. I wonder, could the same be said about other metrics or other points in time in the life cycle of an FCPA enforcement action, particularly what is very common in corporate enforcement action nowadays, and that's post-enforcement action compliance obligations imposed upon the companies by the DOJ or the SEC. Even in the absence of a formal corporate monitor, more often than not, there's going to be periodic reporting requirements for a 1 to 3 year period often, an obligation to, go out and conduct periodic audits. So does your concern here flow through to that, recognizing, of course, a company that has just resolved the DOJ or SEC enforcement action has every incentive in the world to otherwise comply with the law, but here again, they're being told, what they have to do, and what they have to do sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense in many cases.
Even I guess it really, I wasn't really going after that quite as much, honestly. I think it really depends upon sort of the facts and circumstances of each particular case. I would say that especially on that sort of that monitoring, the sort of the post-resolution reporting or auditing or monitoring side of this, I would actually say, and I think it's one of the increased strengths with the FCPA enforcement practice at DOJ and SEC in recent years is I actually think there's a much more sophistication and understanding there of a lot of these kinds of issues and surrounding compliance programs and how they actually operate and then what you would be monitoring. I say this in that I've been involved over the years with the Stato monitorship sort of now almost 10 years ago, and then more recently the Alliance One monitorship, and then it also has been involved in other ones over the years. And I think that as this practice has expanded, there's a lot more sophistication with the regulators on this space, and I think also increased sophistication with sort of also the monitors who are appointed in terms of, I think, understanding what sort of a reasonable reporting or auditing or monitoring post resolution. And I think, in at least the cases that I've seen, I think that the regulators, in most cases, I think understand that those sort of post-resolution mechanisms, aren't designed to be sort of looking under every stone or looking at every entry in the company's books and records, but is there to really get a sense of how the organization is operating at a broader level post-resolution. And I think, and that whatever the post-resolution mechanism is, that it's sufficiently tailored to the specific risks and the specific issues that got the company into trouble in the first place. I know certainly the companies, when they are looking at these post-resolution procedures, that's definitely what they're looking for, is a system that's sort of that's tweaked in such a way to really be focused on the real issues, and not looking at aspects of a company's business that have absolutely nothing to do with the FCPA issues that ultimately led to the resolution.
So the Yates Memo, of course, is I think 1 year old tomorrow. We're speaking on September 9th right now. The pilot program is approximately 6 months old now. How do we, at this point in time, analyze those programs and assess whether these programs and the policies embedded in them have achieved their desired result, represent a net positive versus a net neutral versus, perhaps even a net negative? How do we analyze this? Can we analyze this?
Well, I guess if you look at the last few months, in terms of, the individual prosecution component of Yates, I don't think we've really seen that yet. Which is not really a surprise. If the idea is that companies are supposed to tell as much as they possibly can about individuals, which presumably is going to lead to DOJ prosecutions of individuals, it's not surprising that hasn't really happened yet, even though a year is a long time. Bringing a case against an individual, if you're going to do it right, is going to take some time. So I think on that one, you can't really evaluate it yet, but I don't think that's honestly that surprising. As far as the pilot program, and I think there are definitely, I think one of the positives for practitioners and for companies, as we've had sort of these series of very public declinations by the DOJ, it certainly does say, well, if I tell the DOJ about a matter, it does not necessarily mean that I'm going to get prosecuted by the DOJ. Now, I may end up having an issue with the SEC, but the DOJ is going to decline. So that certainly is a positive to a certain extent, and I say to a certain extent because it seems like many of the declinations that the DOJ has made, again based upon the limited facts that are out there about those cases in the last 6 months, in many ways they don't really seem like cases that really warranted a prosecution anyway. But that being said, getting sort of the news out there about public declinations is a good thing, and but it also does it's clearly there to reinforce the messaging to companies, self-disclose, and this is the benefit that you might get later on. I mean, I guess for Yates, pardon me, not for Yates, but for Yates and also for the FCPA Pilot Program. I mean, I think the question will really be in I think sort of the more challenging fact pattern, similar to the one Mikey described a few minutes ago, where a company identifies a problem, conducts a thorough investigation, remediates, maybe disciplines people, maybe fires some people, changes a lot of corporate policies and procedures, and then makes the rational business decision not to self-disclose, and then at some point in the future, the DOJ becomes aware of this, and then the company, now that the Department of Justice is aware of it, now fully cooperates. I think that's sort of that's the harder fact pattern, and I think that's the one that you want to see what happens in that situation. And does a company still get credit? Does a company still get substantial credit when you've had, you said before, when you've had corporate managers exercise their business judgment and say, this is just not a case that I'm going to self-disclose at all, and see what is what happens in a fact pattern like that. I mean, and I think that will really, I think in many ways that'll really give you the guidance as to for practitioners and for corporate management as to how to approach these issues.
Yeah, obviously time will tell on that. Obviously, I agree with your spot-on observations regarding some of these so-called DOJ declinations over the summer from the only information in the public domain, and that would be the SEC's order. There's an open question as to whether there were any actual viable criminal charges, so-called, declined. I had a whole separate podcast with a guest on that issue. Thanks for sharing your insight and your spot-on observations, both in the article you published and here. Obviously with a government-sponsored program as both, or policy, as both the Yates Memo and Pilot Program are, there's every incentive of the government to say that the programs are working, but it's very difficult given some of the opaque nature of FCPA enforcement to assess, what's really going on. So having your observations, based upon your